guys do this? I need to skateboard more. I mean, maybe you're only a cool YouTuber if you have an electric skateboard. Well, anyway, today we're talking about Slog2, everything you need to know. Let's go. Wish you guys could have just seen it because I almost just died. On a skateboard, it's been like 15 years since I skateboarded, but all of the YouTubers are doing it, so I figured, screw it, let me try. My knee's pretty beat up, but all right. So like I mentioned today, we're going to be talking about Slog2, how to properly expose for it, a couple tools that you could use on your camera to help you expose, and then how we're going to edit Slog2 footage. When I first started, my footage was always grainy and noisy, and I hated it, and I wound up shooting in like movie and Cine 4 profiles. But after watching a bunch of more tutorials and going out and practicing as much as I could, I learned how to find the best way for me personally to get the best footage with Slog2, and I want to share that with you guys today. So rule of thumb, a lot of people have this discussion about whether you overexpose or expose properly. I noticed that if you expose 2 stops over and even a little bit more by having that 2 like flashing, like I'll show you an example of, that's the best way to expose for your shadows, because that's where everyone notices the noise and the grain when shooting log profiles like Slog2. The benefit to Slog2 is having a ton of dynamic range where you could push and pull the waveform, therefore having a lot better color grade and make your contrasty colors really pop and give you more of a cinematic look. So my first favorite tool that I like to use anytime I'm out shooting video is the ND filter. That allows me to shoot at a shallow field of depth while maintaining the 180 shutter degree rule. So right now I'm shooting at an f2 and I'm using a 1/50th shutter speed because I'm recording this at 24 frames per second. Now it's a bright sunny day, and if you know anything about photo or video, 1/50th of a shutter is a very slow shutter, which allows a lot of light in. So by using an ND filter right now, I'm able to properly expose for that. This way I have a separation between the background and the foreground. The next tool that I like to use built in on the camera is zebras. Now I set my zebra to a custom setting of 107. At 107, your highlights begin to clip. So anytime you see zebras show up on your screen while shooting in Slog2, you know to either dial back your f-stop or adjust your ND filter so that you don't see any more zebras. Right when the zebras go away, you know you're properly exposed. Now the last great tool that I like to use on these cameras is the histogram. I find myself watching the histogram while I'm properly exposing for Slog2 footage. What you want to do is make sure that the shadows on the left-hand side of the screen are actually lifted off that back line. We want to expose for the shadows, so that's why we're shooting at 2 stops over. So when we color grade it and put a proper S-curve, we can lower that and pull a lot of detail and maintain a lot of detail in our shadows. I'm gonna get some B-roll of just random stuff, and then what we'll do is dive into Adobe Premiere, and I'll show you how I edit it using these tools and tips that I just told you guys. This way we can check out how my exposure looks and how my footage looks. Okay everybody, so now we're in Adobe Premiere and we're gonna edit some Slog2 footage. What we wanna do is start with adjustment layers. So we're gonna go to this icon right here, click it, go to adjustment layer, and now select whatever timestamp matches your sequence. For me, it's 24 frames per second, 23,976, hit OK. Next, we're just going to drag adjustment layers onto each clip. This way we could do some adjusting with the color grade and we won't make any adjustments to the clip itself. This way we could toggle back and forth and see the before and afters. All right, so now for the fun part, let's edit some Slog2 footage together. We're in Adobe Premiere, and the first thing we want to do is, after we drag the clips onto the timeline, we want some adjustment layers. This way we can make changes to the adjustment layers itself and not our actual clip. So what we do is click on this icon right here, go up to adjustment layer, and then select whatever timestamp you use for your sequences. For me, it's 24 frames per second, so 23,976 is close enough. Then all we have to do is drag these layers right on top of our footage. Okay, so once we have our adjustment layers set, go over to the color tab on the top And then we're gonna go to this window right here and make sure lumetri scopes is selected. Now, I use a bunch of different scopes watching my footage, my clips. So if I right click, I'm using the vector scope UV, the histogram, the RGB parade, and the waveform parade. So there's a difference between color correcting and color grading. Color correcting is stretching out your scopes, making sure your white balance is set, using those type of tools to make sure your footage is set up correctly for color grading. Color grading is just adding those cinematic vibes and colors and making your footage really pop. So the first thing we want to do on Slog2 Footage, or the first thing I like to do, is start with the S-curve. So right here we have our scopes, and notice how everything's kind of in the middle to upper region. Well, what I'll do is go over to curves and then select a point right here and just start to stretch it out. Then I'll make a point right here and bring it back up. And by doing this, already you can see the difference. Now on this day, it was very bright out. I had to blow out the background if I want to expose for the part that I was really trying to capture correctly. So if we go right here and do a little playback, already we can see that the footage looks great. Next, I like to go over to the basic correction tab and just play around with the highlights, could bump up the contrast, drop the blacks if you like. I don't really like super contrasty footage, so I try to watch my S-curve and any adjustments I'm making. And then if we want, because Slog2 is very flat, we can always bump up the vibrance and the saturation. And right there, going back and forth, that looks pretty good to me. Now let's go to the next clip. Very dynamic shot right here. We have clouds, we have a foreground and a subject. So notice how everything once again is not clipping on the bottom. And at the top right here, you could kind of see the highlights are starting to clip. Now you never want either 100 or 0 touching. So what I'm going to do is go back to my curves and just start dragging it down. And you can notice that it's bringing out some contrast. And now you could bring it down and stay on this sector, or you can move to the right if you want it darker. For me, I'm going to keep it right about here and try to bring the blacks to 10, which is right here. Next, I'm gonna click my highlights and bring them a little up, but if I bring them up too high, I'm losing a lot of dynamic range. So at this point, I'm just gonna leave them right here and then click on the mid and bring the mids up. This way we're gonna brighten up the foreground and the mids, but we're still going to keep that shadow detail. So if we look at the scope on the left, everything is stretched out nicely right here, your RGB, and we have the most dynamic range right now for grading. So now I'm going to go over to creative. I like to bump up the saturation like I had mentioned. And if we look at this scope right here, the saturation is moving towards like the orangey yellow area. And that's the color that the foreground was that day. We were at Alabama Hills and it was very like that earthy tones, which makes sense. Bring up the vibrance a little bit. Now we get to have some fun with the basic tab. So let's add some contrast just a little bit. Let's bring our highlights down a little bit more. Shadows, I want those mountains to pop. So take a look at the mountain range right here and here. And if we bring the shadows down a little bit more, get it to pop really nice. Maybe bring the blacks down and right there. So now the footage is starting to look really good. It's coming together really well. If we toggle back and forth, there's a significant difference. Next, I'll go over to the color wheels and match, and we could play with our midtones, shadows, and highlights even more, and you could even change the tints of them by dragging these points around. So if I want my midtones to be blue, I could drag it over into the blue section. If I want it to be a little bit more orange, a little more poppier, I could bring it there, but I'm not going to do that. I'm just gonna raise my mids a little bit more and pull my highlights down a little bit more. Now, if some of you guys are wondering why I'm not using a LUT, I don't always like to use LUTs. It's a good starting point, but for this tutorial, I want to show you how you can color grade and color correct yourself manually without having to start with a LUT. The next footage, I was over at the Korean Bell of Friendship in San Pedro, and this was the top part of it. And there was a lot of color and a lot of detail. So what we're going to do, once again, stretch out those scopes. So let's add some contrast by dragging the curve. And then we're gonna pull up our mids. And that's looking pretty good already. I mean, the difference just by adjusting the tone curve is insane. And that's why I always start with the tone curve. Next, we'll bump up the vibrance and see how that looks. And that looks horrible. So we're gonna go a little bit and then we'll pull up the saturation a tad. Then we could go in, add some contrast, see how the highlights look. Pull the shadows back a little bit, maybe the blacks. I'm actually gonna stretch the highlights up a little bit. And then, here we go, that's our footage right there. Huge difference once again, really gets that color to pop. And that's it. For the last clip, let's start with the S curve. Pull it down. And I was on a fire escape, so that's why it's kind of bright. Let's bring this up top. Bring this down slightly. And this is just a little bit too much. Let's go to creative and add some vibrance. And let's play this clip back. Let's do it full so you guys can see it. All right, that looks good to me. So right there, that footage looks great. I'd keep it right there, wouldn't even touch it. So sometimes it takes a little bit more finessing than not, but you can guys play with your footage, test it out, and go out there and have some fun shooting S-Log2. Practice makes perfect. So that wraps up today's video, guys, on how I like to expose and edit S-Log2 footage. If you thought this video was helpful, leave a thumbs up or let me know in the comments below. Now, if you guys edit S-Log2 footage in a different way, let me know also. I'm really curious to hear how you guys take your approach to exposing for this log footage correctly and or how you guys like to edit it. Until next time, guys, I'm Jason Anthony. I'll see you soon. Peace. I split my shit open.
You did? Your knee?
No, my fucking crotch.
Oh, no, you didn't.
No, my leg went and I was like, oh.
You split your